The sound of the iron cooling on the board was the only steady thing in my kitchen when the message came through. Call me immediately. The letters glowed on my phone like a flare, and for a moment I thought it had to be a mistake. My lawyer of 20 years had never once sent me a message like that. Not when my husband died. Not even when the insurance company tried to contest the settlement. I pressed call with my hands still damp from folding the linen napkins I was bringing to dinner. His voice came tight, not like the measured tone he used for paperwork or bank transfers. "Margaret," he said, "you need to listen and not panic. Sit down." I lowered myself into a chair, eyes on the lemon bars cooling in their tin. "This is about your daughter-in-law." The words thudded in my ears. "Cassandra?" He explained in clipped phrases, the way professionals do when every word matters. Background check inconsistencies, employment history that doesn't exist, references traced to a shell nonprofit, wire transfers with labels like tuition and household that never touched any of the accounts she claimed. I told him he had the wrong person. Cassandra works late at the hospital. She brings home cards from children. She calls me Mom Thompson like she means it. But he kept going. The call log from her supposed employer routed through a prepaid service. The EIN number on her pay stub belonged to a dissolved charity in Arizona. "Margaret," he said, "this isn't gossip. These are receipts." I stared at the chalkboard where I'd written flour and cinnamon, the groceries I meant to pick up. For the first time, the simple list looked like it belonged to someone else's life. I asked him what to do. His answer was immediate. "Go to your son's house now. Do not call ahead. Do not confront her alone. Just get there." My chest tightened as I thought of James, my boy who still hugged me like a child even at 42. I thought of how proud he'd looked at his wedding, his hand in Cassandra's, both of them lit by the candles I had paid for when the reception hall bill exceeded the budget. I thought of the house with its manicured lawn and picture windows, paid for in part with the proceeds from the home I sold after 37 years. Another file pinged through to my phone, a PDF with neat rows of numbers. 3 transfers of $4,800 each, one of $1,000, all landing in a Phoenix credit union. In the memo line, household, loan, reimbursement. My hand trembled as I scrolled. Attached beneath was a draft beneficiary form, unsigned but filled out in my son's name. The signature at the bottom wasn't his handwriting. The refrigerator hummed like it always had, but the kitchen suddenly felt foreign. I pressed my palms flat against the table, trying to remember how to breathe. Cassandra had convinced me to sell my home. She'd convinced me that helping them would mean closeness, Sunday dinners, a place at their table for the rest of my days. Now I was staring at proof that she might have been rehearsing lines the whole time. I gathered the lemon bars, slid my navy dress from the chair, and placed the files in my purse under the crossword book I used to pass long evenings. When I stepped outside, the neighbor's sprinkler arced across the grass, catching the late Sunday. Everything looked ordinary. But the weight in my bag was anything but ordinary. I locked the door behind me and whispered to no one, "Tonight, I find out who she really island." The drive across town felt longer than it ever had, though the streets were the same ones I'd taken 1,000 times before. My hands clutched the wheel so tightly my knuckles blanched, and the lemon bars slid on the passenger seat each time I braked too hard. Every red light seemed to taunt me with the question I couldn't answer. What if all of this is true? The radio played a commercial about retirement savings, and I shut it off, heart pounding. I thought of the retirement I'd pictured, the garden club, maybe a small trip to Maine in the summer, time with grandchildren. Instead, I was in a rented apartment with cheerful yellow walls that had begun to look garish, and I'd poured the majority of my savings into my son's wedding because Cassandra had looked me in the eye and said, "You'll always have a home with us." The memory returned in sharp detail. Cassandra at my kitchen table, hands folded, her hazel eyes wet with practiced emotion. "Mom Thompson, you shouldn't be rattling around in that big old house. We'll take care of you." At the time, her words had felt like balm. Now, replayed against the lawyer's warnings, they stung like a betrayal. As I pulled onto the wide avenue leading to James's neighborhood, I noticed how steady the street lamps were, how perfectly the lawns were trimmed. All of it spoke of security, permanence, Yet the papers in my purse told another story, one of false identities, phantom jobs, and transfers siphoned away like water through a crack. When I reached the house, I didn't get out right away. The driveway was lit up by James's car, gleaming like success, and through the wide front window I could see silhouettes moving in the kitchen. For a moment I let myself imagine it was all a mistake. Cassandra humming over her lasagna, James pouring wine, both of them looking up with the easy smiles of people who had nothing to hide. But then I noticed something small. The painting James loved, the one he'd insisted on keeping when we cleared out the old house, wasn't on the wall. The space above the fireplace where it should have hung was filled instead with a sleek, abstract piece that screamed of Cassandra's taste, not his. A cold shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just the art. As I studied the window, I saw no trace of James in that living room. Not the clock his father left him, not the framed photos of his college years. The house had been scrubbed of him, replaced with Cassandra's curated image. I sat in the car, staring, until the lemon bar's sweet smell turned cloying in the enclosed air. My phone buzzed with another message from my lawyer. Do not confront her alone. Speak to James first, quietly. I closed my eyes and remembered my husband's funeral. James's small hand gripping mine so hard I thought my fingers might break. I'd promised him, then I'd protect him always. Tonight, that promise felt heavier than ever. Finally, I opened the car door. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of cut grass. From inside the house came laughter, Cassandra's bright and clear, James's lower but tired, almost strained. I tightened my grip on my purse. In a few minutes, I would walk through that door. And in doing so, I might have to unravel my son's entire world. James opened the door before I could knock. His smile was wide, almost boyish, but there were shadows under his eyes I hadn't noticed before. He wrapped me in a hug that was warm but faintly hurried, as if he was already carrying too much weight. Perfect timing, he said, ushering me inside. Cass is making her famous lasagna. The word famous snagged in my thoughts. Famous with whom? She hadn't been part of our family long enough to create traditions. But I smiled, handed him the lemon bars, and stepped into the living room. The first thing I noticed was how little of him was here. The mantel where his father's antique clock once sat now displayed a row of glossy design magazines. The shelves that had held his college football memorabilia were lined with scented candles and neutral pottery. Even the sofa was new, cream-colored and spotless, utterly unlike the worn leather chair James used to sink into after long days. "Mom Thompson!" Cassandra swept in from the kitchen, apron tied over her designer jeans, hair styled like she'd just stepped out of a catalog. She hugged me warmly, too warmly, the kind of embrace that felt rehearsed. "I'm so glad you're here. Can I get you some wine? I opened that Pinot Grigio you brought last time." Her tone was light, but her eyes flicked to my purse as if measuring what I'd brought with me. I forced a smile. Wine would be lovely. As she bustled back into the kitchen, I leaned closer to James. "Honey, you look tired. Everything all right at work?" He hesitated just a fraction too long. "You know, consulting late nights, deadlines, nothing I can't handle." But the smile didn't reach his eyes. I wanted to ask more, but Cassandra's voice floated from the kitchen. "Dinner's ready in 20 minutes. We sat for a moment in the living room, the silence stretching. Finally, I touched his hand. "James, can we talk privately?" Before he could answer, Cassandra appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a towel. "Is everything okay?" she asked, eyes narrowing just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. "Fine, sweetheart," I said with a smile that felt brittle. "I just wanted to hear about James's presentation next week." Her lips curved, but her eyes stayed sharp. "Of course." She lingered a beat too long before retreating. James exhaled once she was gone. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go to my office." We walked down the hall, and in my peripheral vision, I saw her standing perfectly still by the kitchen counter, not moving toward the stove, not touching a pan, just watching us go. The calculation on her face made my blood run cold. Inside James's office, the air felt different. The bookshelves still held his old business texts, the framed photo of us at his college graduation, the leather chair he loved. It was the only room in the house that still felt like him. He sank into the chair, rubbing his temples. "Mom?" he said. "What's going on?" I closed the door softly behind me and took a breath. "James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. How much do you really know about Cassandra's past?" His expression faltered. For a moment, relief flickered across his face, as if I'd voiced a question he'd been afraid to ask himself. "She grew up in Denver," he began slowly. "Lost her parents in a car accident. Put herself through nursing school. Moved here 3 years ago." I leaned forward. "Have you ever seen pictures of her family? Her graduation? Met any colleagues?" His silence was louder than any words. He stared at his hands, and I saw the doubt creep into his eyes, widening like a crack in glass. "Mom," he whispered, "why are you asking me this?" I reached into my purse and slid my phone across the desk, the investigator's notes glowing on the screen. James leaned forward, scanning the screen, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. The investigator's notes laid it out plainly. No employment record under Cassandra's name, the call logs bouncing through prepaid lines, the false EIN on her supposed pay stubs. His lips parted like he wanted to protest, but nothing came out. "That's not possible," he whispered finally. "She takes calls about patients. I've heard her. She talks about children she's treated," I asked softly. "When have you actually heard those calls, James? Did you ever hear both sides of the conversation?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes darted, searching memory for something solid. "She always steps into another room. Says it's confidential. Have you ever been to her hospital? Met her coworkers?" His voice shrank to almost nothing. "She told me personal visitors weren't allowed in pediatrics. Policies." He rubbed at his forehead as if trying to erase the thought. "Mom, if this is true." Before he could finish, the faint ding of the kitchen timer echoed down the hallway, followed by Cassandra's cheerful voice. "Dinner's ready?" James's head snapped toward the door, eyes wide like a boy caught between loyalty and dread. "What do I do?" he whispered. I reached for his hand. "We go eat dinner. We act normal. And I figure out how to tell you the rest." But when we stepped back into the hallway, a chill rippled through me. Cassandra was standing at the stove, spoon in hand, posture too rigid, too alert. She wasn't looking at the food, she was watching the doorway. And in that moment, I knew she'd heard more of our conversation than either of us had realized. The dining table was set like a magazine spread. My old china plates, linen napkins folded in precise triangles, a vase of fresh lilies. Cassandra smiled as she placed the steaming lasagna in the center, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I wanted tonight to be special," she said. "James has been so stressed, we could all use a family dinner." I slid into my seat, keeping my face smooth. Inside, every nerve was taut. I studied her every movement, the way she cut her lasagna with surgical precision, the way her eyes flicked to James when he looked uncertain, the way she steered the conversation like a captain guiding a ship through fog. "So, Mom Thompson," she said suddenly, her tone too casual, "how are you settling into the apartment? I hope you don't regret selling the house." The words landed like a knife disguised as a compliment. My pulse quickened. "Actually," I said lightly, "I've been thinking about the sale. It's been almost a year, and I never really got a clear picture of where all the money went." James looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" I set my fork down. "The wedding cost $47,000. I contributed $35, but I gave you $50 in total. What happened to the other $15? The silence was instant, thick as smoke. James's brows knitted as he did mental math. Cassandra's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "There were additional expenses," she said finally, her voice smooth but her eyes wary. "The honeymoon, some house improvements, my student loan payments." I tilted my head. "Student loans? I thought you told us you worked your way through school." James's head snapped toward her, confusion etched across his face. "Cass, you said you had no debt when we applied for the mortgage. I handled the paperwork. You were clear." For the first time, I saw the mask slip. Panic flickered in her eyes, just for a second, before she smoothed it over. She reached for his hand, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "I didn't want you to think less of me." But James pulled his hand back. His voice dropped, steady but cold. Where are the loan statements? Cassandra pushed back her chair abruptly, the legs screeching on the polished floor. I need to check on dessert, she said, and disappeared into the kitchen. James turned to me, his face pale. Mom, what else did your investigator find? I reached into my purse and placed the folder on the table, sliding it toward him. The words caught in my throat, but I forced them out. Her real name isn't Cassandra Williams, it's Catherine Blackwood, and you're not her first husband. James stared at the folder like it might burst into flames. His hand hovered above it before finally flipping it open. Inside were copies of marriage certificates, divorce filings, even a police report from another state. His eyes scanned the pages faster and faster until he stopped cold at a line highlighted in yellow. She was married before? Twice? His voice cracked. Yes, I said gently, though my heart was pounding. Both marriages ended the same way when the husbands discovered their accounts were being drained. My lawyer's investigator confirmed the pattern. He pushed his chair back, standing so suddenly it scraped the hardwood. No, she loves me. His words stumbled, collapsing under the weight of the evidence in front of him. I reached across the table and touched his hand. Honey, she's good at her job. Too good. That's why you believed her. Why I believed her. The clatter of running water and the sound of cabinet doors slamming came from the kitchen. Ordinary noises, but threaded with menace. I lowered my voice. There's more. The $15,000 I gave for the wedding, it didn't go toward loans or improvements. It was wired to an account in Phoenix, an account connected to her sister. James frowned. Her sister died in that car accident. That's what she told me. I held his gaze, steady. That story doesn't check out either. The kitchen fell silent. Too silent. James glanced toward the doorway, dread dawning on his face. She's listening, he whispered. I nodded. My stomach knotted, but I forced calm into my voice. James, where does she keep her purse? He blinked. On the counter by the back door. Why? Because if she's who we think she is, she won't stay to explain. She'll run. Almost on cue, the back door creaked. James and I shot to our feet, moving quickly but quietly down the hall. The kitchen was empty. The curtains swayed in the cool evening breeze, and on the counter, the purse was gone. She's running, I breathed. James rushed to the front window. Her car's still here. She probably has another one parked nearby, I said, adrenaline surging. But then James froze. Mom, her phone. She left it on the table. We both hurried back to the dining room. There it was, lying next to her untouched plate of lasagna, screen dark but unlocked. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The call history was nearly empty, too clean. But the messages told a story. At the top of the thread was a contact saved as Marcus. My throat tightened as I read aloud. The old lady is getting suspicious. How much longer do I need to keep this up? The account in Phoenix needs more time. James's face drained of color. He took the phone, scrolling with shaky hands. Emergency. She hired a PI. Need extraction plan now. This was sent today. I laid a hand on his arm. James, sit down. You need to hear all of this. He looked up at me, eyes wide and breaking. She was planning to leave anyway, wasn't she? I nodded slowly. Yes, but not before she took everything she could. I reached for the phone again, opening the Photos app, nearly empty except for screenshots, bank statements, insurance documents, investment accounts. Every single one bore James's name. She's been cataloging your assets, I said softly, building her final withdrawal. James collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. She wanted me to change my insurance beneficiary tonight. Said it was romantic. I closed the folder and placed it gently in front of him. She wasn't planning a marriage, honey. She was planning an exit strategy. James sat hunched at the table, the folder open in front of him, Cassandra's phone still glowing with damning evidence. His shoulders shook, but not from tears, more like the tremor of a man realizing the foundation of his life had been built on sand. She said it was romantic, he whispered, almost to himself. That making each other beneficiaries was proof of love. He gave a hollow laugh. I thought she was thoughtful, careful. Turns out she was calculating. I swallowed hard. She mentioned it to me too, James. She was circling not just your accounts, she was circling mine. His head snapped up, eyes wide. Yours? I nodded. Remember when she asked if I'd updated my will? She pressed about whether I'd make provisions for my son's spouse. At the time, I brushed it off as curiosity. But now I see it for what it was, the endgame. The silence in the house grew oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, a normal sound in an evening that was anything but normal. James raked a hand through his hair. God, Mom, how did I not see this? How did I let her into our lives so completely? I reached across the table, steadying his hand with mine. Because you wanted to believe in her. So did I. We both ignored the little things, the missing details, the stories that never quite added up. My phone buzzed, startling us both. A new message from my lawyer lit up the screen. Margaret, do not panic. The task force is already moving. Keep James safe. We'll be there within the hour. I showed him the message. They're coming. We're not alone in this. But James's face twisted with something deeper than shock guilt. Mom, there's something I didn't tell you. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim folder. Inside were forms, joint account applications, partially filled out. Cassandra's neat handwriting on every line but the signature. She's been pushing me to add her for months. I kept putting it off because work was so hectic, but I promised I'd finish them this week. I exhaled, equal parts relief and dread. Then your hesitation may have saved you. The air shifted suddenly. A faint noise at the back of the house, footsteps on gravel. James and I locked eyes. She wouldn't come back, he whispered. But then we heard it. The faint creak of the back gate. I grabbed his hand. Call the police. Now. He fumbled with his phone, dialing with shaking fingers, while I slipped Cassandra's phone into my purse and slid the investigator's folder on top. My heart pounded so loud it felt like it might give us away. The operator answered, and James's voice cracked as he explained. But even as he spoke, I moved to the window and pulled back the curtain a sliver. At the far end of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light, a quiet figure lingered in the shadows, not moving, watching. She's here, I whispered. James turned white. What do we do? I looked down at the purse, heavy with receipts and evidence. For the first time that night, clarity washed over me. We wait, I said firmly. We wait until the police arrive, and then we end this. The minutes stretched like hours. James sat rigid beside me, phone pressed to his ear as he gave our address again to the dispatcher. I kept my eyes on the window, the curtain edge pinched tight between my fingers. The figure at the fence hadn't moved, though I swore I felt her gaze cutting through the shadows. Then movement. The back door, the one she'd slipped out through, eased open just a fraction. I saw the faintest glow of the porch light catch on the brass handle. My pulse hammered in my ears. She's trying to come back in, I whispered. James shook his head, disbelief mingled with dread. Why? She knows we found everything. Because she doesn't know how much we know, I said quietly. And she doesn't walk away from unfinished business, not when there's still money on the table. The sound of tires crunching gravel snapped my attention to the front. A pair of headlights swept across the living room wall. Relief surged police. James exhaled sharply, shoulders sagging. But the back door creaked again, wider this time. I gestured for him to stay still. The footsteps were soft, practiced. Margaret Thompson? A strong voice called from the porch. Detective Rodriguez, Santa Fe PD. I nearly collapsed with relief. I hurried to the door and opened it. A sharp-eyed woman, maybe my age, stood flanked by two uniformed officers. She gave a curt nod. Ma'am, we've been briefed by your attorney. Where is she? I pointed toward the kitchen, voice tight. She's trying to come back inside. The detective's expression hardened. She motioned silently, and one of the officers slipped around back while the other entered with her. James and I stood frozen in the dining room, the untouched plates of lasagna cooling in front of us, the smell suddenly nauseating. Then a shout. Stop! Police! The slam of the back door rattled the frame. Boots pounded on tile. Within seconds, the officer returned, shaking his head. She bolted through the fence. Fast. Detective Rodriguez cursed under her breath. We'll catch her. She can't run far without that purse. She turned to me. Ma'am, you probably saved your son from losing everything. James slumped into a chair, staring at the unsigned beneficiary forms still spread across the table. His face was pale, but there was something else there now, a flicker of relief, maybe even resolve. She was going to make me sign them tonight, he murmured. Said it was romantic. I placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Nothing says I love you like $1 million life insurance policy, I said dryly. Detective Rodriguez almost smiled. Ma'am, I'll need you both to work with our financial crimes unit. We'll trace the transfers, identify her accomplices, and build a case. As she spoke, I glanced at the table where Cassandra's no, Catherine's phone still lay. My stomach tightened. The last message to Marcus glared up at me. Need extraction plan now. Whatever she was planning wasn't finished. Detective Rodriguez slipped on gloves and picked up Cassandra's phone. She scrolled quickly, her face tightening. Most of this has been wiped. She's careful. But not careful enough. She tilted the screen so we could see. These threads, with Marcus. He's not just a boyfriend. He's logistics. He's the one who moves the money. James rubbed his temples. So she wasn't working alone. Not even close, the detective said. Women like Catherine rarely are. They build networks, fake employers, sham references, even people who pose as family if needed. This Marcus is part of a larger web. The word web made my stomach twist. I thought of every holiday meal I'd shared with her, every warm hug, every time she'd leaned close and called me Mom Thompson. All of it threads in a net designed to catch us. Detective Rodriguez set the phone down carefully. We'll get a warrant for the Phoenix account. That will tie her to the sister story, if the sister even exists. But I need you both to understand she's been at this for years. There will be more victims. Maybe dozens. I pressed my palm against the cool surface of the table to steady myself. What happens to the money she already took? The $15,000 from me? The transfers from James? The detective's gaze softened but didn't waver. Some of it can be clawed back if it hasn't been laundered, but these operations move funds fast. Honestly, the bigger victory is stopping her before she escalates. James sat back, his voice low. Escalates how? Rodriguez hesitated, then met his eyes. Your mother was right. These scams often end with the spouse being made the beneficiary. We've seen cases where sudden accidents aren't accidents. She was patient, she stayed longer with you than with her other victims. That tells me she had her sights set on more than just your accounts. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the table. She wanted me, my savings, the rest of my retirement. The detective nodded. She probably saw you as the long game. James was the entry point. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. My throat tightened, but when I spoke, my voice was steady. So what do we do now? Detective Rodriguez leaned forward. Now we set a trap. We let her think there's still a way back in. She won't be able to resist finishing what she started. James shot up from his chair. Absolutely not. I won't let my mother be bait. I put a hand on his arm. It's not your choice, honey. It's mine. His eyes widened, hurt flashing across his face. Mom, I squeezed his arm. I've been handling dangerous situations since before you were born. I lost your father, I held this family together, and I let myself get fooled because I wanted to believe in love again. But this I can handle. And if it means stopping her from ruining someone else's life, then I'll do it. Detective Rodriguez watched me closely, then nodded. She'll reach out. They always do when they think there's still money on the table. And when she does, we'll be ready. I drew in a deep breath. Outside, the night air stirred the curtains, cool and sharp. For the first time since the phone call that shattered my world, I felt something stir inside me too. Not fear, not grief, resolve. 3 days later, I was sitting in a corner booth of a coffee shop downtown, the hum of the espresso machine covering the sound of my pounding heart. Detective Rodriguez's team was spread out casually, one by the window with a laptop, another pretending to read the paper, a third lingering near the pastry case. To any outsider, it looked like a normal Tuesday afternoon. To me, it felt like walking into a storm. Catherine had taken the bait exactly as predicted. After I sent a carefully worded message through a mutual contact in her phony hospital network, she responded within hours. Her texts dripped with contrition. I left because James was controlling. I still love him. I just want to make things right. Could we meet, Mom Thompson? You always understood me. I almost laughed when I read it. Understood her. No, what I understood now was the shape of her performance. The delayed pauses before her tears. The calculated affection. The way she'd always known just how to tug at the edges of my loneliness. At 2 sharp, the door opened, and she walked in. My breath caught. Gone was the polished blonde with perfect lashes. She wore darker hair now, cropped shorter, clothes chosen to make her look fragile, almost desperate. Even her makeup was smudged to suggest sleepless nights. A performance, down to the last detail. Mom Thompson, she said softly, sliding into the booth across from me. Her eyes shimmered with manufactured tears. Thank you for coming. I forced my lips into a warm smile. Of course, sweetheart, I've been worried about you. She reached across the table, taking my hand. The gesture might have once melted me. Now, I noticed the slight pressure of her grip, testing for control. James doesn't understand, she whispered, voice trembling. He thinks I lied about my past, but it's just misunderstandings. Confidentiality at the hospital. Family photos I don't like to revisit. Trauma. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue. He's convinced I stole money. From you even. You don't believe that, do you? I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch. Well, sweetheart, the transfers were curious. $15,000 to Phoenix. Her eyes flickered just for a second, but then the mask snapped back in place. That was to help a friend. She was struggling. I didn't want James to judge her. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. Funny. Because the investigator traced that account to your sister, the one who supposedly died in a car accident. Her smile faltered, and for the first time, the sweetness drained from her face. Her eyes hardened, calculating. How much do you really know? She asked, voice dropping its tremor. And in that moment, the performance was gone. What sat across from me was not a weeping daughter-in-law, it was the predator my lawyer had warned me about. I smiled, calm and steady. Everything. That single word hung between us like a stone dropped into water. Her expression shifted, the tears gone, the softness gone. In their place, pure steel. You have no idea what you're dealing with, she hissed. Actually, I said, lifting my hand just slightly, I do. Detective Rodriguez appeared at my side so quickly it was as if she'd materialized out of thin air. 2 more officers closed in from behind. Catherine Blackwood, Rodriguez said firmly. You're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and financial elder abuse. Catherine didn't resist. She didn't plead. She just looked at me with eyes full of venom. This isn't over, she said as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. I met her gaze without flinching. Yes, it island. The cafe grew silent as the officers led her out. Conversations paused, cups clinked louder than they should have. Strangers leaned in their chairs, whispering, trying to piece together who this woman was and why she was being taken away in handcuffs. For the first time, her mask had cracked in public, and everyone could see it. I sat back in the booth, my palms pressed flat against the cool surface of the table. My heart was still racing, but there was a strange calm underneath. I had faced her and survived the performance. No more smiles designed to disarm me. No more affectionate Mom Thompson to cloud my judgment. Detective Rodriguez slid into the booth across from me, her expression both serious and a touch impressed. You did well, she said. Kept her talking long enough. She confirmed more than she realized. What happens now? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. We'll process her. The Financial Crimes Unit already has subpoenas lined up. That Phoenix account? Frozen. And Marcus Rodriguez tapped the phone still in her hand. He won't stay hidden long. With her in custody, he'll panic. That's when we'll catch him. I nodded, absorbing it all. Around us, the cafe slowly returned to life. The hiss of milk steaming, the grind of beans, chairs scraping against tile. But something fundamental had shifted. The woman who'd nearly dismantled my family with charm and deception was gone. Later that evening, back at my apartment, James sat across from me on the worn couch. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in a week, but there was relief in his eyes too. "She's really gone?" he asked, voice low. I handed him a cup of tea, watching his hands tremble slightly as he wrapped them around the mug. "She's in custody. And this time, it's not just us. There are other victims, other families. The task force will make sure she can't slip away." James swallowed hard, staring into his cup. I keep replaying everything in my head. The dinners, the conversations, the way she laughed at my jokes. How could I not see? I reached over, resting my hand on his. "Because you wanted love to be simple. Because she was skilled at making herself into exactly what you needed. That's what predators do." His shoulders slumped, but he nodded. "Still feels like I should have protected you. Instead, you protected me." I smiled faintly. "That's what mothers do." Silence settled between us, not heavy this time, but healing. The kind of quiet that comes when a storm finally passes and the walls of the house are still standing. My phone buzzed. A message from Rodriguez. Preliminary trace successful. At least $200,000 tied to her network. Likely recoverable. More updates tomorrow. I showed it to James, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something like hope in his eyes. "She didn't take everything," he said softly. "No," I agreed, squeezing his hand. "She didn't, and she never will." 6 months later, the air in Santa Fe carried the sharp scent of piñon smoke and desert sage. I sat on the deck of my new home, a modest adobe cottage with a small garden patch I'd chosen myself, no one else's opinion guiding me. James joined me, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. His face had changed since that night. The lines of exhaustion had softened. He was rebuilding, one careful day at a time. The trial was underway, and Catherine Blackwood was facing a stack of charges that stretched across 4 states. The prosecutors had built their case not just on our evidence, but on testimony from more than a dozen other victims. Each story mirrored ours: whirlwind romance, sudden marriage, assets drained. Some men had lost retirement accounts, others had lost homes, but all had lost trust. "They're estimating she stole over $2 million, James said, passing me the mug. His voice was calm now, not frantic like it had been months ago. "But the task force thinks we'll recover about 60%. Rodriguez says that's better than average." I took a sip, the coffee rich and earthy, grounding me. "Money comes and goes. What matters is we stopped her, and we're still standing." He looked at me, something complicated flickering in his eyes. "Can I ask you something, Mom? And I need you to be honest." I braced myself. "Go ahead. Did you ever really like her? Or did something always feel off?" The question sat between us like a stone. I thought of Cassandra's warm hugs, her sweet Mom Thompson voice, the way she'd looked me in the eye and told me I'd always have a place with them. I thought of the little lies, the stories that never had details, the way she deflected whenever I asked about her past. I wanted to like her, I admitted finally, so much that I ignored my instincts. There were things that didn't add up, but I told myself I was being too critical, too protective. I wanted her to be the daughter-in-law I'd dreamed of. James's throat worked as he swallowed. I think part of me already knew too. I just didn't want to face it. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of children laughing from a nearby park. For a long moment we listened, the sound stitching something broken inside us. "You weren't stupid," I told him firmly. "Neither of us were. We were human. We believed in love. That's not a crime." His eyes glistened, and he nodded. "Still feels like I failed." I reached over, squeezing his hand. "Then let's fail at something worthwhile, like believing in love, rather than succeed at being cold and suspicious of everyone." A laugh broke from his chest, the first real one I'd heard in months. It warmed me more than the coffee. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky with ribbons of purple and gold, I checked my phone. A message from my lawyer glowed on the screen. "Final restitution hearing scheduled. Likely 60% recovery. Congratulations." I showed it to James. "Better than we expected." He smiled faintly. What will you do with it? I thought for a long moment. Some of it will go to a fund for fraud victims. The rest? I looked at the horizon, the wide open sky that felt like possibility. Maybe I'll finally take that long vacation. Somewhere warm, where nobody knows my story. Just me, being a woman enjoying her retirement. James grinned. That sounds perfect. Can I come? I laughed, the sound surprising me with its lightness. I thought you'd never ask. And as the last light faded, I realized Catherine Blackwood had taken money, trust, and time. But in losing her, I'd regained something more precious, my own strength, my son's honesty, and the promise that we would rebuild together. The restitution hearing came faster than I expected. Sitting in the courthouse, surrounded by families who had lived their own versions of my nightmare, I felt an odd mixture of sorrow and solidarity. A man from Colorado leaned over during a recess, clutching a folder of documents like a life raft. She drained my retirement in 7 months, he whispered, his eyes red-rimmed. I thought I was the only fool. I shook my head. You're not a fool. None of us are. She preyed on what was good in us, the part that wanted to believe. When the judge read the restitution order, 60% of losses to be returned, tied to frozen accounts and seized assets, a ripple of relief spread through the room. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And for the first time, we had the proof that justice wasn't just a word. Back home, the relief turned into resolve. Thanksgiving arrived, and with it, our extended family. I insisted on hosting in my new home, even though it was smaller than the one I had sold. The table was crowded, the air rich with the smell of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes, and for once, every voice around me felt like it belonged. But the tension came too. My cousin Linda, who had always had opinions about how I should handle my finances, brought it up over dessert. You know, Margaret, she said, her fork slicing into pumpkin pie. Maybe if you'd planned your estate more carefully, none of this would have happened. Some of us think you should distribute now before another Cassandra comes along. The table went quiet. I saw James stiffen beside me, ready to leap to my defense. But I raised a hand. I set down my napkin, looked Linda straight in the eye, and let my voice carry across the room. Catherine was a predator. I was her target. But let's be clear, this isn't about poor planning. It's about exploitation. And I won't let anyone, family or not, shame me for being human enough to trust. My estate will be handled when and how I choose. And that's the end of that. A murmur swept through the relatives. Some nodded, some looked away uncomfortably, but no one contradicted me. James's hand found mine under the table, giving it a firm squeeze. In that moment, surrounded by family and the flicker of candlelight, I felt something stronger than humiliation or regret. I felt ownership. I had been the victim once, but now I was the one drawing the lines, making the rules. Later, as we washed dishes together, James smiled faintly. You didn't just shut her down, Mom. You shut the whole room down. I chuckled, drying a plate. Sometimes the only way to end a story is to tell the truth in front of everyone who needs to hear it. And as the night wound down, I realized Catherine hadn't just left me scars, she'd left me steel. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came the final sentencing. Catherine Blackwood, once Cassie, once the daughter-in-law I thought I'd prayed for, stood in a courtroom stripped of her disguises. No designer jeans, no catalog-perfect hair, no sweet Mom Thompson voice. Just a gray jumpsuit, her wrists cuffed, her eyes sharp but cornered. The judge read the charges: fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. Each count rang like a bell in that hushed room. When the sentence was handed down, 12 years without parole, a collective breath rose from the benches where victims sat shoulder to shoulder. Some wept, some clenched fists in quiet triumph. I sat very still, feeling both lighter and sadder than I expected. James turned to me, whispering, "It's over." But I shook my head. "No, honey, it's ended. That's different. We'll carry this, but we get to decide what it means." In the months that followed, we did just that. James confronted truths about himself. He'd long avoided the debt he'd hidden, the need to prove he could provide. He started counseling, not because of her, but because of what letting her in had revealed. And I began to live again, I booked a trip for the first time in years, not to Maine or Arizona, places I'd once dreamed of, but to Portugal, somewhere I'd never been. I walked cobblestone streets, tasted wine on sunny terraces, and let the ocean air remind me that freedom wasn't just about money, it was about choosing your own horizon. When I came back, James was waiting at the airport. His arms were stronger around me than I remembered, not because he'd changed, but because we both had. "How was it?" he asked, grabbing my bag. "Perfect," I said simply. I remembered what it feels like to be me. He smiled, a real one, free of shadows. "Maybe next time, I'll come too." And I knew he would. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky in streaks of rose and gold, we sat on my deck with mugs of tea. The air smelled of blooming sage, the quiet broken only by crickets. "Mom," James said, his voice soft, "do you ever think you'll forgive her?" I thought for a long while, then shook my head. "Forgiveness is for those who are sorry. She never was. But I can release her. I won't let her live rent-free in my heart anymore." James nodded, his shoulders easing as if my words gave him permission to do the same. I leaned back, closing my eyes. Catherine had taken money, trust, and nearly our future. But in the end, she had given me something she never intended, the reminder that my instincts mattered, that my love was fierce, and that even at my age, I was stronger than I knew. And sometimes, that strength, the quiet, steady kind, is the most valuable gift of all.